In the winter of 1926, a train departed from Moscow carrying one of the most controversial scientific expeditions the Soviet Union would ever authorize. Aboard was Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov, a respected biologist who had spent decades perfecting the art of artificial insemination in horses. His destination was French Guinea in West Africa, and his mission was something that would have seemed like pure science fiction to anyone outside the inner circles of Soviet scientific planning. Ivanov had convinced the Bolshevik leadership to fund an attempt to create a hybrid between humans and chimpanzees, a living bridge between species that would, in theory, provide evidence for materialist evolution and strike a blow against religious conceptions of human exceptionality. This was not the fever dream of a madman working in isolation. This was state-sponsored science, backed by Soviet rubles, endorsed by influential figures within the Academy of Sciences, and driven by an ideological conviction that humanity could be understood, improved, and even redesigned through the application of rational scientific principles. To understand how the Soviet state came to sponsor such an extraordinary experiment, we must first understand the intellectual climate of the early Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks, who seized power in 1917, were committed materialists who viewed the world through the lens of dialectical materialism, a philosophical framework that rejected supernatural explanations and insisted that all phenomena, including life itself, could be explained through material processes. Religion was not merely wrong in their view, but actively harmful, a tool used by the ruling classes to pacify the masses with promises of heavenly reward. The new Soviet man would be freed from such superstitions through education, science, and the transformation of society itself. In this context, proving that humans were not divinely created, but rather animals who had evolved from other primates, took on enormous ideological significance. A human-ape hybrid would be living proof that the boundary between species was permeable, that humans were indeed part of the natural world, subject to the same biological laws as any other creature. Ilya Ivanov was born in 1870 in the Russian Empire and had established himself as a pioneer in the field of artificial insemination well before the Revolution. Working at the Imperial Institute of Experimental Medicine in St. Petersburg, he had successfully created hybrid offspring between various species of animals, including zebras and donkeys, and various combinations of bovine species. By 1910, he had already begun speaking publicly about the theoretical possibility of creating ape-human hybrids, though such talk remained purely speculative under the Tsarist regime. The revolution changed everything. The new Soviet government was eager to demonstrate the superiority of Soviet science and to make dramatic breakthroughs that would validate Marxist-Leninist ideology. In 1924, Ivanov submitted a formal proposal to the People's Commissariat for Education and Health, outlining his plan to attempt hybridization between humans and great apes. Remarkably, the proposal found a champion in Nikolai Petrovich Gorbunov, the head of the Department of Scientific Institutions, who saw in the project both scientific merit and ideological value. The project received initial funding of $10,000 American dollars, an enormous sum for the cash-strapped Soviet state in the mid-1920s. The money came from the Society of Materialist Friends, an organization dedicated to promoting scientific research that would undermine religious belief. Ivanov's plan was methodical and reflected his decades of experience with animal breeding. He would travel to a location where chimpanzees were readily available, establish a research station, and attempt artificial insemination using human sperm and female chimpanzees. If successful, the resulting offspring would be raised and studied, providing unprecedented insights into human evolution and the nature of species boundaries. The ethical implications of such experiments were either not seriously considered or were dismissed as bourgeois sentimentality. In the utilitarian calculus of early Soviet science, the ideological and scientific benefits outweighed any concerns about the welfare of the test subjects, whether human or animal. Ivanov arrived in French Guiana in March 1926, accompanied by his son, who served as his assistant. They established themselves at the Pasteur Institute's primate research station in Kindia, a facility that housed numerous chimpanzees and other primates used for medical research. The French colonial authorities, unaware of the true nature of Ivanov's experiments, granted him access to the facility. Between March and June of 1926, Ivanov performed artificial insemination on at least 3 female chimpanzees using human sperm. The details of where he obtained the human sperm remain unclear in the historical record, though it seems likely he used his own or his son's. The experiments were conducted with the clinical precision Ivanov had developed over his career, but the results were uniformly negative. None of the inseminated chimpanzees became pregnant. Ivanov attributed this failure to various technical factors, including the possibility that the chimpanzees were not in the correct phase of their reproductive cycle, or that the genetic distance between humans and chimpanzees was too great for fertilization to occur through artificial insemination alone. Undeterred by this initial failure, Ivanov began planning a second phase of experiments that would prove far more controversial. If human sperm could not fertilize chimpanzee eggs through artificial insemination, perhaps the reverse would work. Ivanov proposed inseminating human women with chimpanzee sperm. This represented a dramatic escalation, moving from experiments on animals to experiments that would directly involve human subjects. The ethical chasm between the two approaches seems obvious from a modern perspective, but Ivanov and his Soviet sponsors operated under a different moral framework. They believed they were engaged in work of profound importance, work that would advance human knowledge and strike a blow against religious obscurantism. The ends in their calculation justified the means. Returning to the Soviet Union in 1927, Ivanov began making arrangements for this new phase of research. He needed human volunteers, or at least human subjects, who could be persuaded or coerced into participating. Documents from the Soviet archives reveal that Ivanov initially hoped to find volunteers among Soviet women who would willingly participate in the name of science. He drafted advertisements and appeals that would be distributed through medical facilities and scientific institutions, seeking women who would agree to be inseminated with chimpanzee sperm. The language of these appeals is striking in its combination of scientific formality and ideological fervor, promising participants that they would be contributing to a breakthrough of world historical significance. Whether any Soviet women actually volunteered remains unclear, but Ivanov also pursued a darker alternative. He approached officials in the Soviet healthcare system about the possibility of performing the inseminations without informed consent, potentially on patients at gynecological clinics who would be unaware of what was being done to them. To facilitate this research, Ivanov needed a colony of great apes on Soviet soil. He lobbied successfully for the establishment of a primate research station in the subtropical climate of Sukhumi, in the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, on the eastern coast of the Black Sea. The Sukhumi Primate Research Station was formally established in 1927 and would go on to become one of the Soviet Union's most important facilities for primate research, though not for the purposes Ivanov originally envisioned. Ivanov arranged for the transport of several chimpanzees from Africa to Sukhumi, including a male named Tarzan, who was to be the source of sperm for the human insemination experiments. The logistics of this operation were formidable, requiring the construction of specialized facilities, the training of staff, and the development of protocols for maintaining the health of great apes in a climate quite different from their native habitat. By 1928, everything seemed to be in place for Ivanov to proceed with his experiments. He had his primate colony, he had institutional support, and he had at least tentative approval to move forward with inseminating human subjects. But the political winds in the Soviet Union were shifting in ways that would prove catastrophic for Ivanov and his project. Joseph Stalin had consolidated his power and was beginning to assert control over every aspect of Soviet life, including the scientific establishment. The relatively freewheeling atmosphere of the 1920s, when scientists like Ivanov could pursue controversial research with minimal oversight, was giving way to a more paranoid and controlling regime that demanded absolute loyalty and viewed any form of independence with suspicion. In December 1930, Ivanov was suddenly arrested by the OGPU, the Soviet secret police. The charges against him were vague and almost certainly fabricated, involving alleged participation in a counter-revolutionary organization. This was a common pattern during Stalin's terror, when politically unreliable individuals, or those who had fallen out of favor, were arrested on trumped-up charges and forced to confess to crimes they had not committed. Ivanov was sentenced to 5 years of exile in Kazakhstan, far from his research station and his primates. The reasons for his arrest remain a matter of historical debate. Some historians suggest that his experiments had become an embarrassment to the Soviet leadership, particularly as the regime sought greater international respectability. Others point to internal politics within the Soviet scientific establishment, where rivals may have used the increasingly paranoid political atmosphere to eliminate a competitor. Still, others note that Ivanov's patron, Gorbanov, had himself fallen under suspicion, and that Ivanov's arrest was part of a broader purge of Gorbanov's associates. Whatever the true reasons, Ivanov's arrest effectively ended the hybridization project. He was sent to Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan, where he died in March 1932, at the age of 62, less than 2 years into his exile. The official cause of death was given as a stroke, though the conditions of his exile would have been harsh enough to compromise anyone's health. The chimpanzees at Sukhumi remained, and the facility continued to operate as a primate research center. But the specific project of creating human-ape hybrids was quietly abandoned. No official announcement was made, no papers were published explaining the results, or lack thereof. The project simply ceased to exist, becoming one of the many strange episodes of early Soviet science that would remain largely unknown until researchers gained access to Soviet archives decades later. But Ivanov's work, bizarre as it was, did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader pattern of ambitious, sometimes reckless biological research in the early Soviet Union, driven by a combination of genuine scientific curiosity and ideological fervor. The Bolsheviks believed that human nature itself was malleable, that through proper application of scientific principles, they could create a new type of human being, better suited to communist society. This belief manifested in numerous ways, from educational experiments to psychological research to Ivanov's attempts at hybridization. The underlying assumption was that there were no sacred boundaries, no aspects of human existence that were off-limits to scientific investigation and potential modification. Consider the broader context of Soviet biological science in this period. Ivanov was not the only scientist pursuing radical ideas about heredity and human improvement. The 1920s saw vigorous debates about eugenics, with some Soviet scientists advocating for selective breeding programs to improve the genetic stock of the Soviet population. Others explored the possibilities of rejuvenation through glandular transplants, hoping to extend human lifespan and vitality. The most famous of these researchers was Serge Voronov, a Russian-born surgeon working in France who transplanted monkey glands into human patients, claiming he could restore youth and vigor. While Voronov was not working in the Soviet Union, his ideas were followed with interest by Soviet scientists, and similar experiments were conducted at Soviet research facilities. The ideological foundation for all of this work was the belief that Lamarckian inheritance was correct, that acquired characteristics could be passed on to offspring, and that, therefore, the environment could be manipulated to produce permanent improvements in human biology. This view found its most infamous expression in the work of Trofim Lysenko, who would come to dominate Soviet biology in the 1930s and 1940s, with disastrous consequences for Soviet agriculture and for the many geneticists who were imprisoned or executed for opposing his pseudoscientific theories. But in the 1920s, before Lysenko's rise, there was still genuine debate within Soviet biology, and researchers like Ivanov could pursue their ideas with institutional support. The question of what Ivanov actually hoped to achieve, beyond the immediate goal of creating a hybrid, reveals the deeper assumptions underlying his work. In his writings and proposals, Ivanov suggested that a human-ape hybrid could serve multiple purposes. It would provide definitive proof of human evolution, demonstrating that the genetic distance between humans and other apes was small enough to permit hybridization. It would offer unprecedented opportunities to study the biological basis of human cognition and behavior by comparing the hybrid's development with that of normal humans and apes. And perhaps most ambitiously, it might even lead to the development of a new species that could be exploited for labor. This last possibility, though rarely stated explicitly in Ivanov's formal proposals, appears in some of his correspondence and in the recollections of his colleagues. The idea was that a creature with the physical strength of an ape but with enhanced cognitive abilities derived from its human heritage could be trained to perform tasks too dangerous or difficult for humans, essentially creating a biological slave race. This aspect of Ivanov's vision reveals the dark underside of the Soviet project of human transformation. For all the rhetoric about creating a new socialist society free from exploitation, the actual practice of Soviet science in this period often involved a callous disregard for individual dignity and autonomy, whether of animals or humans. The same regime that spoke of liberating the working class was willing to contemplate the creation of hybrid beings who would be condemned to servitude by their very nature. This contradiction was not unique to the Soviet Union, of course. The 20th century is littered with examples of states and scientific establishments pursuing research that violated basic ethical principles in the name of progress or national interest. But the Soviet case is particularly striking because of the explicit ideological commitment to human liberation that coexisted with practices that denied the humanity of research subjects. The technical feasibility of Ivanov's project, viewed from the perspective of modern genetics, was always minimal. We now know that humans and chimpanzees, while sharing approximately 98% of their DNA, are separated by roughly 6 to 7 million years of evolution. This genetic distance, while relatively small in the grand scheme of life on Earth, is significant enough to make hybridization extraordinarily unlikely. There are substantial chromosomal differences between humans and chimpanzees. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, while chimpanzees have 24. And these differences create barriers to successful fertilization and embryonic development. Even if fertilization were to occur, which would require overcoming significant biochemical incompatibilities, the resulting embryo would almost certainly not be viable. Modern reproductive biology has demonstrated that successful hybridization between species is largely limited to very closely related species that have diverged relatively recently in evolutionary time. Horses and donkeys can produce mules, lions and tigers can produce liggers, But these hybrids are typically sterile and often suffer from health problems. The genetic distance between humans and chimpanzees is far greater than that between horses and donkeys or lions and tigers. Contemporary geneticists consider the possibility of a viable human-chimpanzee hybrid to be vanishingly small, though not quite zero. The ethical prohibitions against attempting such an experiment are now universally recognized in the scientific community, enshrined in international agreements and national laws governing research involving human subjects. Yet the story of Ivanov's experiments continues to resonate, not because of what he achieved, which was nothing, but because of what his work reveals about the intersection of science, ideology, and power. The early Soviet state was willing to fund and authorize experiments that crossed fundamental ethical boundaries because those experiments aligned with ideological goals and promised to deliver propaganda victories. This pattern would repeat throughout Soviet history. From the fraudulent agricultural claims of Lysenko to the massive environmental disasters caused by poorly planned industrial projects. The assumption that nature, including human nature, could be reshaped at will through the application of sufficient force and scientific knowledge led to tragedy after tragedy. After Ivanov's death and the abandonment of the hybridization project, the Sukhumi Primate Research Station continued to operate and indeed expanded significantly. During World War II, the facility was evacuated as German forces advanced into the Caucasus, but it was re-established after the war and became a major center for biomedical research. Soviet scientists used the primates at Sukhumi for studies of infectious diseases, radiation effects, and space medicine. Many of the apes and monkeys that flew on Soviet space missions in the 1950s and 1960s, paving the way for human spaceflight, came from Sukhumi. The facility operated throughout the Cold War, housing at its peak more than 7,000 primates of various species. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought catastrophe to Sukhumi. The facility was located in Abkhazia, a region that became a war zone as Georgia descended into civil conflict, and Abkhazia fought for independence. The war of 1992 to 1993 devastated the research station. Staff fled, funding disappeared, and the primates were left without adequate food or care. Many died of starvation or disease, while others escaped into the surrounding countryside. The once proud research facility, which had represented the ambitions of Soviet science, became a ruin, a victim of the chaos that followed the Soviet collapse. In recent years, there have been efforts to restore the facility and rebuild the primate colony, but it has never regained its former prominence. The broader legacy of Ivanov's work and the scientific culture that enabled it extends beyond the specific fate of one research station. The story illustrates the dangers that arise when scientific research is subordinated to ideological goals and when ethical constraints are dismissed as obstacles to progress. The early Soviet period was characterized by a genuine enthusiasm for science and a belief in its transformative potential. But this enthusiasm was not tempered by adequate consideration of moral boundaries or by respect for the autonomy and dignity of research subjects. This pattern was not unique to the Soviet Union. Similar ethical failures occurred in Nazi Germany, in Imperial Japan's biological warfare program, and in various Western countries that conducted unethical medical experiments on prisoners, psychiatric patients, and minority populations. But the Soviet case is particularly instructive because it shows how a regime that claimed to be building a more humane society could simultaneously pursue research that was profoundly inhumane. Modern bioethics emerged in large part as a response to the revelations of unethical research conducted in the mid-20th century. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947 in response to Nazi medical experiments, set forth basic principles of research ethics, including the absolute necessity of informed consent. The Declaration of Helsinki, adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964, further elaborated these principles and established guidelines for medical research involving human subjects. These frameworks were developed precisely to prevent the kind of research that Ivanov attempted, research that treated human beings as mere experimental subjects without regard for their autonomy or welfare. Yet, even as we have developed more robust ethical frameworks, the temptations that drove Ivanov's research remain. The desire to push the boundaries of biological science, to understand and potentially modify the human organism, continues to motivate researchers around the world. Contemporary debates about genetic engineering, synthetic biology, and human enhancement echo many of the themes present in the Soviet experiments of the 1920s. We now have technologies that Ivanov could never have imagined. Tools like CRISPR that allow for precise editing of genetic sequences, techniques for creating chimeric embryos that contain cells from multiple species, and artificial intelligence systems that promise to revolutionize our understanding of biological systems. The question of how to pursue scientific advancement while respecting ethical boundaries remains as urgent today as it was in Ivanov's time. The story of the Soviet attempt to create human-ape hybrids stands as a cautionary tale about the consequences of allowing ideological fervor to override ethical judgment, about the dangers of treating living beings as mere instruments for achieving political or scientific goals, and about the unpredictability of scientific ambition unmoored from moral constraint. Ivanov was not a monster in the conventional sense. He was a skilled scientist who genuinely believed his work would advance human knowledge. But his willingness to cross ethical boundaries, enabled and encouraged by a state that recognized no limits on its power to reshape reality, led him to attempt experiments that violated the dignity of his potential subjects, and that, had they somehow succeeded, would have created beings condemned to exist as objects of scientific curiosity, rather than as individuals with inherent worth. The fact that his experiments failed, that no hybrid was ever created, does not diminish the moral significance of the attempt. The Soviet state's willingness to authorize such research reveals the profound ethical bankruptcy at the heart of a system that claimed to be creating a new and better world, but that in practice often treated human beings and other sentient creatures with callous disregard. As we continue to grapple with the possibilities and perils of advancing biological science, the story of Ilya Ivanov and his doomed attempt to bridge the species barrier through the creation of human-ape hybrids remains a powerful reminder that scientific capability must always be balanced against moral responsibility, and that the pursuit of knowledge, however noble it may seem, can never justify the violation of fundamental ethical principles.